All right, thank you everybody for joining us today. First, before I kick this off, I do want to give a nice, thank you to Robert Childress, Kevin Clark at the Masters Conference for hosting and promoting. We have a great panel today, and thank you all as well for participating. Today's topic is managing discovery of corporate chat communications. So corporate communications are moving away from email and turning to real-time messaging apps like Slack, Teams, Line, Hangouts, Zoom, like we're doing today. And really what we're going to talk about today is how does this impact discovery, internal investigations, or other litigation? And also, does this expand to mobile devices? So we will have the panel introduce themselves shortly, but as a housekeeping item, we are very emphatic on please use the Q&A. Ask the panel questions. We will field them individually, or I will be asking those as well, but we all have access to that. So please think of this more of a conversation where we can explore, and go down some rabbit hole, trails if we need to. So what we will do is we're first going to start with Joy. She's going to kick off with introductions, and then we'll have Rich Robinson, Robert Keeling, and George Socha with their introductions. Joy?
Hello, thank you. Hello, I'm Joy Murao. I'm from Practice Aligned Resources, PAR for short. My background is 20 years in big law, running practice support teams and consulting with corporations and the like. So I've just been doing legal technology training and education the last couple of years with my company.
Thanks, Joy. And thank you, Rick, for having us. My name is Richard Robinson. I am the Director of Legal Operations and Litigation Support for Toyota Motor North America. I have been in the industry for about 20 years as well, and spent most of my time on the law firm side, but I've also worked on the vendor side and spent the last 9 years in corporate. So the last year I've been with Toyota. Prior to that, I was with JCPenney as their e-discovery and information manager.
Hey everyone, my name is Robert Keeling. I'm a partner at Sidley Austin. I'm a co-chair of Sidley's e-discovery group, where I do both litigation and white-collar matters with a focus in e-discovery, and end up doing a kind of a wide range of different matters with, again, a concentration on the e-discovery issues with them.
And then George Socha here. I apologize in advance for the background noise. I'm actually in a real large building with other people moving around and making noise. A very different experience for me here, one I haven't had for a long time now. I was 16 years in private practice, 13 years on my own as a consultant, during which with Tom Geldman I started EDRM. Spent the last 4 years with a large service provider, and I'm back on my own providing expert witness services, consulting services, and in Richard's terminology, working as well as a fractional CXO. If you need to figure that out, ask me, I'll tell you. Thanks.
That's excellent. Thank you. Thank you everyone again for joining, and thank you panel. For those who have just joined, because I see it's starting to pile up here, please, this is an open type of conversation. We have a Q&A section, so please, if you have questions throughout this presentation, please ask any questions. I'm Richard Clark. I'm with ESIAnalyst and a co-founder of the Masters Conference. I work with legal teams and investigators tackling all of these modern data types. And so again, thanks everyone. So we're going to kick this off. The real, again, focus of today is considering corporate chat communications. So we're going to start with the why this is important. And so why, is having these types of data, corporate communication chats like Slack, Teams, even Zoom, and in some instances, why is that important to consider when we're looking at litigation or investigations?
Well, I can kick things off. I'd be interested in what everyone else has to say. But to me, and what I see is why this is really important is because that corporate communications and communications in general are increasingly moving to these applications. When I first started as an associate, well, there was no such thing as e-discovery back then, but a few years later, you could be reasonably confident that if you captured somebody's email and user files and maybe their paper documents, you had 95%, if not 100% of the data for that custodian. Now, that may be the case, or it may not. And it really will depend typically on the department or the individual employee or the corporation generally. And so it means that some people are still using email and the like as their primary mode of communication, but other employees, even some just down the hall, are using, Slack or, Teams or other different forms of platforms for their primary mode of communication. And so it represents a lot of challenges when you're kind of trying to get the data and trying to figure out what happened about where to go, where that communication is taking place.
And I was going to add on that the why is the behavior around chat is different in regards to email or more documented meetings. So I think the content in the chat is definitely a big difference with our e-discovery.
There's both a difference in quantity, or go ahead, Richard, then I'll jump in.
Okay, thanks. I was just going to reiterate some of the things that Robert and Joy said. I think that, communication has always been the crux of discovery, whether it was paper discovery or e-discovery. Most of our litigation centers around communication. And so as the culture changes, right, and we move from more formal, back in the day it was letters, and now then it became emails, and then it shifted to text and collaborative communication platforms like Teams and Slack and et cetera. You have to understand the culture of the organization that you're working with, and sometimes it's the entire organization, the entire enterprise, and sometimes it's down to individual business units or down to individual people. So understanding the matter that you're working on and the people involved and their personal and corporate cultures will dictate, what form of communication is the most relevant to the matter at hand. So so it shifts from matter to matter. Even now, it's not, you can't just rely on one form of communication as being your only source of discovery for that matter.
So I'd like to add a point and then give a couple of examples to bolster others, or really three. So Richard just talked about you can't rely upon one communication. I recently took the contents of a mobile device, a cell phone, that had been primarily put into Excel spreadsheets, took those Excel spreadsheets and started working with that data in Microsoft's Power BI, which is, you can do a lot there. And one of the things that was obvious once I started looking at the chat communications from that exercise, so there weren't any email messages, but as I looked at those chat communications, I would see a thread start in one platform, jump to a second platform, continue in a third platform. If you're only getting email, which we're used to getting, then you are in a bit of trouble potentially. The second point is the sheer variety of materials. I wasn't dealing with, from that phone, the chat communications from one chat platform. There were SMS, MMS, chat, and various other types of chat communications all in there. So there's a wide range of those to look for. And then in a matter I worked on a few months ago, we got the contents of the mobile device of a high net worth individual who was involved in a matter. We got his email from his Gmail account, and then we got his WhatsApp messages. I think there were a couple thousand email messages in the Gmail account. And the WhatsApp messages, I forget, it was either 46,000 or 64,000 messages. So the quantity of messages potentially there are ones that we had no idea we would see. And then in both those examples, back to, I think it was Joy's point, the way people communicate there is very different from how they communicate in email. There's much more formal language used in email, far less formal, casual to an extreme often in the chat communications.
And I wanted to add one more point to that, the chat concept of it all, is that we used to, when back in the day when we would do Link or Skype, they weren't saved, right? They were more ephemeral, like things were, we didn't back it up. And now as you move into more structured Slack or Teams where the whole unit is actually captured and saved, I think that's different with the mindset that people think it's going to go away, but it actually doesn't. So I think that's dangerous too.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you all for those points. So one of the things we hear also as a kind of a secondary to this is some of those are, can be ephemeral. They can have, auto deletion policies. What are some of your thoughts around preservation or, some policies around keeping that data or having that deleted? What does that look like?
So I think one, it's a challenge. So as Joy was saying, it really depends on the platform. So you could have a company that has no retention around their Skype, has different retention around like their internal corporate messaging platform, and yet other retention around their Slack or Teams or what have you. And so you need to kind of understand that when you're going in to assess. And while all things being equal, as in e-discovery, for these platforms, you would prefer less retention periods than shorter retention periods rather than longer. The issue that you run into in platforms like collaborative platforms like Slack and Teams and the like is that you'll get a lot of pushback from the business because kind of the point of those platforms is to allow collaboration. So it's not just communication, but the SharePoint type backends that you have, for example, on Teams, allow the storing of files and reference type documents that the employees can use in their business and ongoing. And so a lot of times they don't want that to be rolled off on a continual basis. So that is a kind of a challenge from e-discovery and the tension of how the business actually uses those platforms.
Yeah, and to add on to that, Robert, I coming from the information governance side back in my time at JCPenney, I would add that the only thing worse than having no policy is having a policy that you don't follow. So I think it's really important for organizations to identify what they are using for their communication platforms, codify what those platforms are so that it's not the Wild West and anybody can pick and choose whatever they want to use, and then create a policy that works for the individual business units, but also is as much risk averse as you can be, in a way that allows the organization to actually implement and follow those policies. Because creating a policy that makes it just too complicated to track or to audit is almost worse than having no policy at all. And
to that end, training people, I take a training perspective on a lot of things, is that it's great to create policies and procedures, but if the employees aren't aware of the policy that exists, sometimes it's kind of buried in a handbook or some once a year meeting. If you're also not including certain items in performance evaluations to make sure that they're adhering to company standards, just giving another touch point to make sure you're doing your best to make sure that policies are being followed. When you look at what's that saying about your weakest link, right? I forgot the saying now, but you're as good as your weakest link or strong as your weakest link. But to that end, it's usually going to be an employee that maybe is a little bit far removed from the why of why we do this. It's going to be someone that picks up a flash drive and puts it in, or puts in information into a document management system that should only be a final draft, but not all the drafts. I mean, you have to look at your business process and make sure employees understand why you do certain things and why those practices are important to your business.
I think there are two particular challenges when it comes to collection of chat communications. One is that even for company sanctioned platforms, often it's hard to figure out where that data actually resides. And then even if you do, hard to determine which data you're able to collect and which data you know is there, but continues to remain unavailable to you. Compounding that, many organizations have BYOD policies and practices in place when it comes to mobile devices, and a lot of chat communications are done on mobile devices. Invariably, at least in my experience, the people who are using those bring your own devices have their own chat platforms on as well, and invariably, whether it's by intent or by accident, they end up communicating on business issues using their private chat platforms where they should be using corporate ones if those even are available.
Yeah, this is great and really segues well into, we can spend just a few more minutes on really user habits. What are, even if we're looking at outside things like WhatsApp and text and those, but even internal, using Teams, Slack being really the main ones, what are some of the habits you see outside of what we see in traditional email? And maybe to frame it a little bit better, when we all look at the Enron data as our demo data sets for our tech platforms, what we see, they were pretty cavalier there. How does that still operate the same way with chat, or are people pretty well, on lockdown on how cavalier they may be in sharing things?
I would say from the law firm standpoint, it's hard to lock things down because you're trying to meet the needs of various clients. Some clients demand we use Teams. Some like to text, which is totally like, this is my personal phone, but okay. So, you just have to be, where you're at. I think maybe Rich, I think corporations might be a little bit easier to put policies in place, but from a law firm, it's hard when you're customer service focused. You have so many clients that you're supposed to communicate the way they need to communicate.
Yeah, and I agree, Joy. I think that it is a little bit easier from a corporate perspective, and it involves policy and it involves training. But the habits that we see, as much as we try to incorporate these things into communication policies and confidential information policies, there is a lower level of professionalism that is employed in using these collaborative platforms that makes it complicated in terms of e-discovery and in litigation. So, as much you want to train people to use the applications, if you're going to use a collaborative application, let's just say Slack or Teams, you convey through training to your employees that it's still a professional application. We're using it to create content for our organization, and then that should be handled in a professional manner. But in our day-to-day use, I mean, people are on Instagram and they're on Facebook and they're on Snapchat or WeChat or when any other form of application. It's a much lower level of professionalism in those applications, and they're used to using the items that are included in those applications, like emojis and GIFs and the like, and so that starts bleeding into professional communication, and that can cause problems.
Yeah, just to emphasize that, because I think that's a really important point, because it's certainly what I see. Email, there's certainly informal communications happening in email, obviously. But, in aggregate, particularly on more senior employees, email is more formal language. You see more formal language, more complete sentences, full paragraphs, things like that. And then there's kind of a middle ground, which is like your public kind of group channels, where they have departments all communicating on certain projects. Those tend to be not quite as formal as like the email, but more formal than the private channels, which resemble much more text chats and the like. And so your type of communication is going to depend on where you're pulling from. But really, I think that private channels is where you see even more of the emojis, GIFs, the memes, things like that, which really complicate your review and analysis because you're pulling in those types of different communication styles that is oftentimes communicating something but not using text.
And also,
I was going to say, in this type of situation, the phrase "trust but verify" is not quite apt, but it's pretty close. Whatever policy you might have put in place, you think you've put in place, you want to make sure you test to see what's actually happening. How you'll be able to test is going to vary depending upon how you're organized, what platforms you use, and the like. Probably your two best sets of test candidates, though, if you want to go out and see who's breaking the system, look to see what's being done by the salespeople, if you have salespeople, and you probably do, and look to see what's being done by the engineers. The salespeople are looking for the easiest way to get their work done, and they're very creative about that, and they really want to get their work done. And the engineers, well, they just want to do something different to see if they can do something different.
I was just going to add it, and also just from legal, being in legal, right, paying attention to who are on the group chats and what kind of information are you relaying, and when do you use the right format? Like, is this going to be, let's meet in person, let's talk about this offline, or let's get on a call specifically to address this, instead of kind of commingling it into these group channels that maybe sometimes can be a little dangerous in regards to content.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So this really does push us into the next category, and this is going to be the impacts on what we traditionally look at as the EDRM. And for those of you who aren't familiar, I'm going to have George kick this off, but it's what we're looking at is how does this data impact collections and preservation? How does it impact review and analysis? And lastly, production and presentation, and maybe even go into some more details on presentation. We do have a question that was asked and that we'll cover off and it's what tools are being used to review all these messages. We'll cover that off in the second section. But to kick this off, George, how does this impact the EDRM generally? And then let's start off with collection and preservation.
So at a certain level, we're just talking about one more set of types of data. All those stages in the EDRM diagram, they continue to apply. You still need to do the basics with all of this data. You need to do it in different ways, potentially, because you're going somewhere else to try to locate the data. You may have challenges in terms of what you've got access to that can make collecting and preserving data difficult. There is a much narrower range of tools available, A, to process that data, and then B, to let you review it in a way that allows for a meaningful review, and then let you analyze it in a way that lets you analyze it effectively. The traditional approaches to review and analysis are largely going to fall flat with this type of data. And then you've got challenges with producing it because the old specifications for email probably aren't going to work effectively with this, which means that once again, you ought to make sure that you're thinking about those types of issues as you're drafting your very first ESI protocols, for example. And then finally, you've got the difficult question about how to present it. Until recently, most tools, once they gave you access to chat data that had been collected, gave it to you essentially in a spreadsheet form, which looks nothing like any of us are used to seeing when we work with chat information. If you need to put this content in front of a witness at a deposition or at a hearing, you want it to look like something the witness is used to seeing, not rows and columns in the spreadsheet, because you're never going to elicit what you need for that deposition or for that hearing. But all the boxes still apply.
For me, I was just going to say, from an information governance standpoint, I don't know how many people are still challenged in merging their paper records policies with their electronic records policies, and then overarching, making sure that your data map with an IT perspective is up to date to incorporate the new systems, like document management systems, sometimes like, where is that on this chart? So, just to make sure that you have your bases covered, if you're a paralegal in the corporate department, asking yourself that when we do a legal hold, are we being thorough, really pushing forward with the questionnaires or the interviewing the custodians early on to ensure that you've discussed and found all those practices that may not be so obvious. So for me, the left-hand side of the EDRM definitely plays a huge role in the corporations, and this corporate chat is such it's a good time to talk about these things, because it is with Zoom and people moving to Teams and Office 365. It's just gotten to be a bigger tool, and then need to address more than just a document management system.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump in here mostly to say that I brought my pipe, so that if I put my pipe in my mouth, that means I want to look smart, but I have nothing to say. But no, actually, on this point, I did have something to say. We frame most of what we do, or I do anyway, in the e-discovery world, in litigation support world, according to the EDRM, right? So when I shifted roles from being in the law firm to being in corporate, and moved my career more onto the information governance side, my perspective shifted further left in the EDRM model, and I have always found it really important to identify trends in technology, especially around communication in an organization, in an enterprise, and thinking about it in terms of EDRM, and how am I going to initiate a legal hold on that data? How am I going to collect that data in the case of litigation? And then how am I going to be able to present it? And very early on, this concept started really around chat messages on cell phones, where it didn't fit quite into the standard review platform model. As George spoke about, most of the time what we were getting when we were doing these Celebrate collections off of cell phones were Excel spreadsheets. And that was a very difficult way to review that. These newer platforms, Slack and Teams, et cetera, are in many ways even more complicated than that, because they create different channels of data, all of which present themselves in very different ways. So, so again, I'm going to go back to the point that policy and training are so important, because when you're, as an organization, trying to identify the right tools, sometimes the coolest and newest tool is not the right tool, because the people that could design that are software engineers who are thinking about what looks good, not considering these e-discovery implications. So involving legal in the process, when IT involves legal in the process of selecting and implementing tools, that's an important part in how you're going to react when litigation arises.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that kind of communication continues, obviously, with your counsel when you have matters, right? And it relates to the point that Joy was making, because again, before we could, if you're putting people under hold and you're preserving data, if it's email, there's lots of very mature systems that can pretty effectively preserve email. There's also very mature systems that can preserve like laptop data and taking snapshots and things like that. The same does not apply for the modern communication platforms. One, obviously, for personal communications, each user can set their retention periods on their phone. But even the corporate platforms, right, the systems, the preservation systems are not as mature as with email. There's no way to preserve part of a group channel, right? So you have to preserve the entire channel. and it creates really difficult issues with respect to the private channel communications in enterprise chat. It's one thing to try and get your hands on them if you have like a hold that has a date certain that ends, and you can maybe try and find out where they all are and put them under hold. It's an exponentially more difficult problem if you have what's known as an evergreen hold, so where the hold is continuing in nature and you're under obligation to preserve data as it's created and on an ongoing basis, because people can just create private channels all the time just with each other, and they just kind of like almost breed, and so the number of private channels increase exponentially over time, and then so trying to get a hold on that from like a preservation or even a collection obligation is extremely challenging, and still is a lot of manual work involved.
Well, it's almost like when you have a new toy and you just, or a pair of scissors, just go run around, have fun, that you need to teach people how to be responsible. And, we can anticipate the kinds of scenarios where people are talking or communicating. And so kind of giving them a guideline on, how to be a good corporate citizen. We talk about that a little bit about training employees. They don't mean to go off the reservation all the time. I'm sure the engineers are wanting to stay within the lines if someone would tell them. Otherwise, there's freedom, right? Like no one said that we have to do anything different. So why not? It's fun. But I think from a corporate and legal operations standpoint, I think there's a bigger role to play besides managing outside counsel spend. There's so much to true legal operations and kind of spanning or assisting with legal technology or technology and legal across all the business units, because all the business units touch HR, they touch IT, they touch legal in some form or fashion. So I think that's where now this coming together, this corporate chat question is going to help hopefully bring us together with everything going on with COVID. You're not going to have the hallway conversations anymore, right? In the sense that maybe people aren't going to be in the offices. They are turning to their alternative forms of communication, whether it's texting or Slack or whatever that is. We know it's going to have a huge uptick in that alternative form. So we have to figure out how we can teach them how to be better at using it.
Absolutely. And this kind of goes into a question that, we're used to targeted collections in regular e-discovery world. So Christine asks a question here. Are you seeing discovery targeting the more unique areas in Teams, such as recorded meetings, whiteboards, emojis, GIFs, and the like?
So Robert and George might have more expansive experience with this than I do, but I'll say that targeting those areas, no, not yet. I'm not seeing that yet. But I do anticipate that as plaintiffs' counsel becomes more savvy with this, as we're trying to, they'll start realizing that those things, especially things like whiteboard and streams, are not easily preserved and or collected. So as a way to twist arms in e-discovery, I can see that becoming more of a practice.
Yeah, so I'm going to use a real technical term for this question in response to this question about targeting within like Teams or Slack, which is it's hard, and it's really hard to do, and particularly like video is a great example. Sure, you can target file types and the like, and kind of pull video from kind of the back end SharePoint, but then what do you do with it, right? And so you kind of have the traditional issues with video or audio. And the tools aren't as advanced as far as, kind of the indexing capabilities aren't quite there yet. And where you pull from it, where you collect from it can be different on how your company, how your client company, where they are in kind of the life cycle. So there are a number of companies that have Teams but still have enterprise on-prem Exchange. And so how you collect that data, the Teams data, especially like the communication, differs than if the company was all the way on Office 365. You have a second place that you have to go to for the data. And so that creates further issues with kind of so-called targeting of that information.
Well, I was going to say, Robert, the thing about the technology, like right now, maybe it's not as prevalent for the searching video and audio, but voicemail, for the last 5 or 6 years have been going to our emails, right? And so pretty soon that technology is going to be commonplace, where you can do a search and it's going to index the voice and the audio, or the video and the audio, and that sometimes people I find rely on like, oh, they're not gonna be able to find it, or Slack, we don't have the enterprise or the plus version of Slack, so they're not gonna be able to collect our stuff. Well, that's just an upgrade to upgrade it and then collect it. So like, pretty soon people can't rely on, what they think is not collectible or searchable. And that's what's dangerous, because technology is catching up so fast. And you mentioned the plaintiff side. I find that the plaintiffs are faster at adopting Office 365 than larger law firms or corporations. I think, one, it's more affordable, and two, they're a little bit more agile since they're smaller, but they're actually taking advantage of Office 365 and all the value it offers because they're usually smaller. So they are becoming more sophisticated on the plaintiff side about the technology that's available, faster than I see some bigger firms that haven't even moved to Office 365 yet. So it's kind of interesting to see where the sword and the shield are starting to play their game in all of this.
And big picture, I continue to see quite a bit of resistance, plaintiffs and defense side both, to the idea of even thinking about this content. We'd much rather just pretend it doesn't exist. In some ways, it's where we were at 10, 15, 18 years ago with email. Let's just pretend it's not there, because it's just too complicated and there's not going to be anything important. Juxtapose that with what those of us who dug into that data see, and it's very important. So at some point, those two worldviews are going to collide in some fashion. And I think I know how it'll end out.
Well, I was going to say to that, with the government, with body cam and chest cam footage now being subject to public records acts for, government and municipalities, that to me, I've seen that push, that technology, because they have to go in and, mass redact and search audio and trying to identify PII across a wide, there are 8 police people on site, then there's 8 chest cams we have to video redact within a very short time of response to that public records request. So I think, again, the technology and the requests are going to be pushing us forward pretty fast.
Yeah, absolutely. I see a question here from Sheila. Just want to let you know, we'll cover this one at the end because we want to move on to a real heart of this conversation is around how do we do analysis and review of this data, which we have 2 questions here that to keep in mind as you answer this question. Once you overcome the difficulties of locating relevant chat and collecting it, how do you analyze, review the chat given the short and truncated format? And then another was, what tools are being used to review all of these messages? So as we look at, review and analysis, what are you looking to do to overcome the difficulties in managing this process in review and analysis?
No, I'll start on this one. I think so much depends upon what tools you already have at your disposal. And that's going to differ from organization to organization. If you have tools that already have some ability to work with this content, dollars to donuts, you're going to be trying to do something with those tools before you try to add anything in at all or turn to anywhere else. If you don't have tools, then it's kind of the same advice as always. Look to see what appears to be in the marketplace. Talk with your colleagues and other organizations to try to find out what they've been using, what they've been having success with. Think about what it is you want to be able to accomplish with those tools. I know that at various times in my career, what I've had to do is figure out how to get the work done with the tools actually at my disposal, as opposed to the tools I wished I could use. That doesn't give you a name for a specific tool, but I think it provides some useful strategies.
George, I think that's fantastic advice. I think that if you are addressing the issue before it's really an issue, right? Before you're actually in litigation and you have to review and produce. If you're preparing for it, then you have the opportunity to really take a look at what you already have in place. I'm a big proponent of asking my vendors to innovate with me. So, calling my vendors to the table, and that could be my outside counsel, that could be my e-discovery vendor, or it could be another software provider that I'm already using, and saying, what do you already have in place, or what are you thinking about putting in place? I think maybe you wouldn't be surprised to learn that a lot of e-discovery vendors who are already hosting data in Relativity have been working diligently to try to create views that make this data more usable, and with varying degrees of success. But it's a good idea to work with those people first, if you already have relationships, if you already have the software, to see what you can do with that software. And then there are vendors out there, and I don't want this to be a Gartner Magic Quadrant conversation, but and obviously Rick is representing one who have tools that have already been built to display this material in a way that's more easily digestible than the old Excel formats, or what has up till now been the standard in Relativity is treating each message as its own individual record, which has its pros and cons. So there are tools out there that do a much better job of that, and can make it more digestible for review. And I'd be happy to talk to people offline if they have questions, but I don't want to get into a product debate.
Well, to that end, sometimes we lose sight of what is a true goal, and it's to have the ability for the attorneys to tell the story and represent their client. Sometimes we're so focused on, I need to run this production and get these documents out and produce these documents. That is just a piece of the discovery, which ultimately is the goal is for the attorney to be able to tell the story. And so I think as more tools become available, as the pain points, as the fact that short form becomes more regular, it's going to be a problem that we all have to address. Therefore, innovation is going to have to happen, right? So, I think it's definitely going to get there, and it's going to get there pretty fast.
Yeah, the main thing I agree with all of that. And the main thing I think folks have to just understand is that the reason why Excel continues to be a predominant way of reviewing like chats is because it's fast. So someone can review several thousand chats in the course of a day, or text in the course of a day, which for your case may be what you're looking for, right? But you have to understand that speed comes at the loss of all the richness around those chats. So you lose your emojis, you lose your GIFs, you lose everything that's accompanying the text. And so if you have like a non-sensitive review and you just need to get through it, Excel's maybe the right tool for you. However, if you want that extra richness and to understand what else was being communicated outside the text, then these other tools are going to be kind of necessary to conduct that review.
And there is another use to which these tools can be put, and which I think we should continue to keep in mind. We've been talking primarily about using tools to collect, process, and then review the data. At some point, you're going to need to put some portion of this data, these chat communications, in front of a witness or in front of a deponent. And if the only way you can do it is put up a spreadsheet, you're probably not going to get very far in that deposition or at that hearing or trial, at least not accomplishing the goals you're trying to achieve. If you've got tools that let you work with the content in a way that looks much like it originally did, it won't be identical, but much like it did, and those tools can help you display the content to those witnesses in a way that makes sense to them, you're probably going to have much better success achieving your goals with respect to those witnesses. So you want to look for that in the tools as well.
That's right.
Yeah, excellent. No, I appreciate all of that. And so, you know, when we look at review and analysis and we look at the chat threads and all of those, we do sometimes find an expansion into other data types like computer activity. So, you know, they save something to an external hard drive. A lot of IP theft, you know, is not just the communications around something, but, you know, everything. So when we talk about presentation, you know, we've found, you know, here at ESIAnalyst is that it's, you know, it also might include geolocation. And so when you're putting the timelines together and doing that review all at the same time, it helps build a lot of context. And I think new data, modern data helps a lot with that because it's all these little databases that you can get to communicate with each other in a platform that makes a lot of good sense. So no, that's excellent. And so we might come back to this because we're going to have story time with everyone on how, you know, they've been impacted with some of these modern data types, but let's move to production and presentation and and this might even be a quick one, but what are the standards in producing these data types like Teams, Slack, maybe a text message, all of that? Is just producing a spreadsheet with what's relevant, or is there more to it?
Standards?
Yeah, so I think the issue is like that we're not yet there as far as a unified standards. And just to take chats, for example, about whether you're just producing the text files, oftentimes that's a default, we're just producing the text. But then even within that, nobody has figured out how to so-called chunk that data. So for like somebody's text message with another person, is a document just the individual text? Is that document the text exchange back and forth? Is the document all texts that happened over the course of that day? Is the document all texts that happened over the course of the week? Or is that document all texts that happen until you have a break of 6 to 8 hours of no activity? And frankly, the decision is case specific and it depends on the other side, but there is no unifying consensus around that.
And let's keep in mind that we've been texting since the late 90s, and we still don't have a good standard on texting, never mind all this other stuff.
I think part of the problem is the language you were using, Robert, reflects the problem itself. We're trying to define text as documents. They're not. There's something different, and we need to deal with them as something different rather than trying to make them a PDF, a version of an email message that should never have been converted to PDF in the first place. We've got to figure out how to treat them for what they are, and that is that they were something different, and we are not there yet.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, thank you all there. So in the interest of time, what we have to wrap this up is, you know, we had a really good planning session, and there was stories around what, you know, the panelists have experienced and, you know, in this modern data. And so this can expand out into other types, but we're going to do a little bit of a question answer session. And Joy, shall we start with you?
Okay, so my story is back to BlackBerry. Back in the day when that was new corporate communication technology, because unfortunately, you know, there's no school or guidebook when the new technology comes out on how you're going to handle this, right? So I know early on, especially when it was the beginning of e-discovery per se, that we didn't understand, you know, the fact that maybe an organization wasn't backing up a BlackBerry server or how they treated that. So it was a great way and a great learning experience early on to learn about that. We work with IT, for example, and understand the systems that they own, again, from an IT perspective, not from a legal perspective, and trying to be that person that's going to bridge that gap and make sure that all the parties are talking so that we can make sure we're protecting our client the best. So for me, was understanding that BlackBerries didn't have to be backed up, right, back in the day, understanding like pin-to-pin conversations, what that meant. You know, it was just a great way for me anyway, early on to learn that. It was at a time when we were all learning, so it was pretty much, I don't want to say acceptable, but we were all kind of fishing through this land of ignorance. Like, I'm sorry, Your Honor, we didn't understand that, our bad, the concept of we did this, there was spoliation purposefully. No, we got away with that a little bit in the beginning because people didn't understand the IT ramifications towards legal, or legal ramifications towards IT. So that was my early on story of, but I do find that it's relevant today, just addressing new technology, but the excuse of not understanding the technology and not understanding the duty to preserve, that's not there anymore. So we have to talk about that. And those are things and conversations that legal and IT, and in some cases HR, need to talk about more proactively.
I'll call on one of you. George, you had oh no, Robert, go ahead.
Sure. So tell a story really that I think illustrates the points we've been talking about, and it was from my last in-person collection, which was in February. Back, it seems like a lifetime ago now, when we were allowed to fly and actually meet people face to face. It was crazy. And just in this collection, I had people communicating business communications through text, through WeChat, through WhatsApp, through Messenger, and then they had their own corporate internal Skype-like communication system. And then part of the company was on Office 365, and part of it still had the legacy Exchange system. And kind of dealing with all of that, in just one case, this is one collection, and trying to kind of marry that up. And I think that's where we're headed. It's going to be more of that as opposed to less than that.
George?
So I used my story 1 and I used my story 2. So I think I'm going to go to my story number 3 here. And Richard, take you up on your invitation to go a little farther afield. This was maybe 2 years ago. And right now I forget whether it was Dropbox or Box. But the same issue presents itself with all of those types of platforms. It was a theft of intellectual property matter. And the allegation was that by that point, former employee had loaded content that he should not have loaded up to whichever platform it was. And then once he put that up as a way of getting it out from his former employer to get to his new employer, he gave various folks access to that content so that they could go look at it, and then if they chose, download it. Where we got brought in is that the former employer wanted to see what had happened in that platform. And this person or his attorney only would provide the documents in the platform. The documents in the platform we didn't need to see. We already knew they were there. What we needed to see were the activities around those documents. Who had looked at what and when, and the system tracked all that information. Who had downloaded what and when, and the system tracked all that information. The challenge we ran into, and it's a challenge that we run into with all of the platforms we've been talking about today, is that that particular platform, Dropbox, Box, it doesn't really matter, although it contained all that content, did not provide any ready mechanism for folks like us on either side, even with permissions, to go in and grab that content, pull it down, and then be able to exchange it and work with it. The best mechanism I was able to come up with, and the other side refused to do this, and the case disappeared before this point was one we could actually take to the judge. The best I could do was to say, pull out your camera or do screen captures, but go to each of these documents in the system, and where you can see the information in 2 different tabs on the right-hand side, do tab 1, capture the screen, do tab 2, capture the screen, and go on. It's not an elegant way of getting the data. It's the best I could think of, and the folks on the other side responded consistently by saying, nope, won't do it. And that's as far as we got before the matter went away, and we never really resolved the issue.
Interesting. Now, Rich, in our preparation meeting, you might have a hall pass. Do you have one, or is your current employer? Where do we sit?
Yeah, I have to take a hall pass on this. It's difficult from a corporate perspective to relay horror stories without betraying the confidentiality of the company that I work for. But what I can say is that in my experience, time and time again, working at law firms and corporations, that having a written policy with training, identifying what the corporate approved applications are for communication, when we get down into the custodial interviews, over and over again, we find them using applications that were not on the list, right? So, I mean, there's not, I can't point to any specific times, but, you know, I've come across WhatsApp and WeChat and HipChat and, you know, Slack when Slack was not on an approved list. And so, and that's a huge one. I mean, I think if it's not approved by your organization, I'd be shocked to find that your engineers, your IT professionals are not using it anyway, because it's just one of those apps that IT professionals seem to be to really love. So that's the key point I want to get across, is that you really have to talk to the custodians to find out what they're using, because just assuming that they're using what are the approved applications doesn't always pan out.
That's great. So let's move to question and answer, as we have about 4 more minutes, so we can do a bit of a lightning round here. Though, Sheila, thank you for your patience. This could be a webinar in and of itself. So the question is, do you believe that some of the issues with collection related directly to legal professionals' lack of understanding of the software, hardware, and people involved? How to cure the lack of information governance?
So I'm going to jump in first, since I went last time. And my answer to that is no, I don't think it's due to legal professionals' lack of understanding. I think that it has to do with software developers' lack of legal understanding, that these applications are not built in a way that are designed to be managed in litigation practice. So that contributes again and again to now, what needs to happen now is that legal professionals become adept and knowledgeable about these applications, and start pushing the developers, pushing the software providers to have those built into their application before they become rolled out in corporate enterprises. But I think it starts with the developers.
I was going to add to that, just so that everyone plays a role in helping translate and share your needs to technology, right? I think that's why you need to bridge that gap, even though I know there's always been this, like, IT speaks one language and legal speaks another, and it's really hard to get them in the same room and talk about these things. So if you're a litigation support person or a paralegal or someone that's in the middle, always talking between the two, I think that you have such an opportunity to provide value and really talk about the practical application of the tools and the technology in what you do in legal every day. So I think it's a great opportunity to build a community around real practical process. And hi, Sheila.
That's excellent. One quick one, Carlo, for productions of short message format, what has been the most common agreed to format, since there are no standards based off of what the panelists have seen? My experience is it really is just the spreadsheet with just responsive data. Is that about right?
Most common, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, or the equivalent, where it's a text file export out of relative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I have
Most common, yes.
PDFs that are
Ideal,
redacted.
no. But go ahead, Joy. I talked over
Oh, I'm
you.
sorry. I was just saying, but I have seen PDFs that are redacted.
Yeah. No, I was going to say most common, yes. Ideal, far from it.
This is great. So we have a couple others questions I can follow up afterwards. We really want to thank the panelists. Thank you, the Masters Conference, for putting this together, hosting this for us. And again, thank you everyone for attending. Your questions have been great. We will have a recording of this. We will be getting that out to everybody. So even if you, want to share that, that is also available to get out to your colleagues as well. Again, thanks everyone. We look forward to another one of these here in the coming weeks.
Thank you, Rick. And thanks to the Masters Conference and Robert Childress for hosting.